As the scene opens, you're preparing to wake up a mechanical relic from a different age. Not for a Sunday drive or any sort of pleasure cruise, but for a day's work. One turn of the key and 4 glow plugs silently begin their toil. Seconds later, the car extinguishes a dashboard light to let you know it's ready. Turning the key a little bit further jolts the starter motor into life. Half a turn of the engine is all that it takes. Sounding much more like an old tractor than a luxury motor car, the engine settles into a familiar, distinctive clatter, which for at least half a century has echoed around the taxi ranks from Europe to Africa and beyond.
Das ist die neue Mercedes T-Reihe.
The troubled but brilliant character of Rudolf Diesel invented an engine in the late 1800s which he initially intended would run on anything. Peanut oil to start off with. His compression ignition engine did away with spark plugs and all the ignition problems that go with them. And the result, after some refinement, was an engine which was heavier, slower, noisier, but much more long-lived and with much better fuel economy. Early diesel engines required a compressor for the injection of diesel fuel. Prosper L'Orange, an engineer working at Benz and later Deutz in the early 1900s, knew we would have to do away with this if we ever wanted diesel engines to be small enough to fit in a car. He would later refine this into the funnel pre-chamber, adding pintle-type injection nozzles and eventually variable injection timing, laying the groundwork for diesel technology that would remain broadly unchanged for more than a century until the advent of direct injection diesel. Mercedes-Benz were the first company to put a diesel engine into a production car in 1936 with the 260D. Citroën fans will tell you it was the Rosalie, which they did build in 1933, but it didn't make it to customers until 1937. After the Second World War, Mercedes was a champion of the diesel engine. Their car range was never without one. They never stopped developing it either. The first 5-cylinder diesel was an OM617. The first turbo diesel was the Mercedes W116 300SD. They put a diesel engine in their C111 sports car prototype, took it to Nardo, drove it for 12 hours non-stop and did 201 miles an hour in it in the 1970s. The only other manufacturer which took diesel seriously in the post-war years was Peugeot. Occasionally other car makers put out one diesel or another for a time, but usually abandon the concept due to slow sales. It's easy to imagine why, especially at a time when petrol was still relatively cheap. Diesel's main attraction is fuel economy. Take that away and you're left with an engine which is noisier, smokier, less powerful by displacement, and was more expensive to buy. So why would anyone? Well, people did. Taxi drivers, the frugal, the Irish, contrarians, people who are interested in something technically different. In fact, if we look at just those Mercedes models which could be bought as either diesels or petrols, the 4-cylinder cars, we can see that after the 170 series, where the split was 51 petrol, 41 diesel, after that, the 4-cylinder diesels outsold 4-cylinder petrols, sometimes by as much as a 60-40 split. By the time we get to the 123 series, and this data includes the 6-cylinder cars, the overall split was 52% in favour of the diesel engine. This at a time when the diesel car market share was still less than 10% in Europe. What we can see from this is the majority of Mercedes customers were inclined to take an already very expensive car, add a very expensive option of a diesel engine, which also made the car much slower and much noisier. They did it with good reason. These engines really were incredibly long-lived. The most famous example is perhaps the Greek taxi driver whose 240D W115, which he bought second-hand, clocked up 4.6 million kilometres, or 2.85 million miles. A million miles without a rebuild came to be generally expected of these cars, in an era when most cars' mileometers only went up to 99,000. Then there was the other taxi driver who bought two W123s new. He thought he'd save the second one for when the first went kaput. The second one was found in a barn last year with the delivery miles and the plastic still on the seats. For a taxi driver 40 years ago, a Mercedes diesel was a no-brainer. Almost cheating to be able to expect a million miles out of one car purchase. So what about today? In this era of environmental consciousness and electric vehicles, where traffic is a lot quicker and creature comforts are expected, is the 240D still a workable prospect for daily use? First, let's clarify which cars we're talking about here. I really should have called this video OM615/616, is it still fit for daily use? But that's a bit of a mouthful. The 240D is almost like the poster child for this era of Mercedes diesels. It was the bestseller and the one most people would recognise. These engines were found not only in Mercedes' car range of the era, but also the light commercial vehicles and Unimogs. We'll just deal with the car-based applications here. Unless you're going to become my hero and daily drive a Unimog, I'll provide a quick overview. Both engines are 4-cylinder, indirect injection and naturally aspirated. The OM615 was the earliest and least powerful, found in the W115 and early W123s badged as 200D and 220D, with 2 litre and 2.2 litre displacement respectively. These engines have between 54 and 60 horsepower. The OM616 was slightly more powerful, also found in the W115 and W123 as the 240D in both cases. Engines built before 1978 put out 64 horsepower. Post 78, the camshaft and pre-chamber was updated to give a phenomenal 74 horsepower. While the two engines are technically separate, they share a lot of parts and are visually almost identical. One important aspect to note, if you're perhaps looking for one of these engines as a replacement or a swap, is the position of the oil filter. This is different depending on what the engine initially went into. So a W115, for example, will have the oil filter facing downwards. The W123 had the oil filter at the top facing up, and commercial vehicle applications have the filter sort of at the back facing diagonally downwards. So, you've selected a nice looking, not too rotten diesel Mercedes. Can you daily drive it? Consideration number 1 for daily use must be reliability. From the humdrum commute to all of life's emergencies, the car must start when you need it. People sometimes like to argue about reliability versus durability, and they tell you that these cars are only reliable if they're looked after and properly maintained. They're right. No machine with moving parts yet made will operate indefinitely without maintenance. This machine needs less maintenance. There are simply less working parts. It was part of the sales literature then, and still holds true now. The Bosch pump that feeds these engines is a beautiful piece of mechanical engineering, and found on tractors the world over, which means you are never far from somebody who knows how to tune it, reseal it or repair it. And if it's throwing diesel fuel in at the right interval, there's not much else to stop the car from running. Compression is the other big component of a healthy diesel engine. There are countless videos out there on how to determine whether these engines still have good compression, so refer to one of them before you go and look at a car. Diesel engines generally don't suffer from head gasket failure, but it's not impossible. A healthy diesel engine will give you lots of warning if it's heading for failure. It'll keep running but get harder and harder to start, probably for thousands of miles before it leaves you stranded. The rest of the drivetrains in these cars is very strong. It only has to deal with 74 horsepower at maximum, so you're not going to be twisting any drive shafts. The manual and automatic transmissions on offer are very trouble-free as well. These cars were built before computer-aided design. Parts tolerances had to be high, and this has contributed to the tough image of these and other old cars. I suppose to sum up the reliability in one sentence, maintenance cannot be ignored, but the car won't leave you stranded. Consideration number 2, economy. Some people are lucky enough that they could throw money at a 15 miles per gallon land yacht as a daily driver, but you have no fear of that with the 240D. Official figures for fuel economy are around 35 miles to the gallon. I get about 40 from my 1984 240D. Of course you can make this less if you have your foot glued to the floor. There really is no need. It sounds like a cliche, but life sort of goes at its own pace when you're driving one of these. Suddenly 50 miles an hour just seems right. Let the rest of the world pass you by in a rat race mode. This is the other legendary attribute of these cars, how slow they are. It is an aspect of them which most certainly has aged since the late 70s. Back then 25 seconds from 0 to 60 would have still been at least on the brink of acceptable, with cars like the Morris Minor still on the roads. These days the Dacia Sandero will do 0 to 60 in 13 seconds in its least powerful guise, and plenty of cars will do it in half that. What does that mean for you? Well, it means you will inevitably hold up a bit of traffic. Manual transmission cars are certainly a bit better than automatics in this department. And I have to say that I imagine this aspect will be a lot worse and more embarrassing than it actually is. As long as you're careful to leave lots of space when you're pulling out, you really won't be annoying too many people. The car will get up to 60 and cruise there all day long if you want it to. My car is happy to do 75 even, although I've seen a lot of people say these cars won't even do that speed. Tired throttle linkages or tired engines can produce a lot of different experiences from car to car, I think. The other aspect of economy is how much parts cost when they're needed. With 2.7 million cars built, there's plenty of spares to go around. And the high number of survivors means plenty of demand to keep the price of service parts down. These cars do suffer from the typical Mercedes issue of individual parts being worth a lot in relation to the cost of a full car. Generally, parts availability is good, and mechanical items are reasonably priced for both the W115 and the W123. Rust is an issue on both. Worse on the W115, but that's not saying much. Buy a good one, keep a close eye on the condition. Make sure the window seals are good, and beware of sunroof drains which rot out and let water into the rest of the car. It would be far more economical to keep the car protected than to pay for bodywork repairs. Driving on salted roads over winter will require care and attention here. But if you do find yourself dealing with rot, reproduction body panels are still being produced and are not too badly priced. The third consideration for daily use: you want to be comfortable. Both the W115 and the W123 were comfortable from factory. But much like the performance of the engine, how they are now depends on how they've been treated in the years between now and then. In both cars, the front seats are the old style sprung types with padding over them. Rear seats are also very springy. Not uncomfortable, but will take getting used to coming from modern seats. These sprung front seats can collapse. The springs break and you're left then with a very uncomfortable situation, usually lying up against the driver's door with a broken spring poking your legs. Seats can be repaired or replaced, but it is something to think about. I find W115s ride a bit stiffer than W123s, which feel a bit more boaty on the road. Neither's uncomfortable. These are small cars on the road compared to modern traffic, but still have good space inside them. They don't feel cramped by any stretch. Most W123s will have a full set of seatbelts, and most W115s will have at least front seatbelts installed from factory, or by the original dealer that sold them. Some W123s even came with airbags, but that's very rare, especially outside of the US. Modern car radios can be installed to give connectivity with phones, which can be charged off the 12-volt cigar lighter sockets which are standard on both cars. Now there are no cup holders, but I find in these old diesels a full cup of coffee will sit very happily in the centre console without falling over, even with all the acceleration on offer. Automatic transmission cars are very comfortable for heavy traffic commuting. These days, the environmental aspect is impossible to ignore. I know people for whom the environmental question would make them think twice about owning an old car. Rightly or wrongly, it would give them a guilty conscience. Like all good hot topics, there isn't a clear-cut, simple answer here. My degree and now day job is in environmental science, and part of my role is creating carbon emissions models, so I feel at least a little bit able to comment here. I will try not to dive too deep. So there are two main aspects to the environmental question regarding cars, and this applies to both classics and modern. Number one is carbon emissions. From the production of the car to the running of the car, the different processes involved create what we now term greenhouse gases, which contribute to global warming. Carbon dioxide, methane, NOx, those are some of the main ones. Global warming was hypothesised as early as the late Victorian age, but scientific consensus for concern here wasn't until relatively recently, really gaining traction during the 1990s. The second, and perhaps the more traditional aspect when it comes to cars, is air quality regarding exhaust and tyre emissions and their effect on human health. Tailpipe emissions were the causes of smog, such as in Los Angeles, where it was severe enough to result in US Environmental Protection Agency legislation regarding vehicle emissions. And when it comes to Mercedes, there's a whole can of worms regarding gasoline-powered imports and emissions control systems added to them in the 1970s. The constituents of air quality issues are commonly carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. It was thought at one stage that because diesel engines emit less carbon dioxide than their petrol counterparts, that diesel was a more environmentally friendly option. In Europe, this was pushed heavily throughout the 1990s, with financial incentives resulting in approximately 50% of car sales being diesel. And this came crashing down spectacularly with the diesel emissions scandal in 2015. Nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter are highly carcinogenic and present in large volume in diesel exhaust. And so from a human health perspective, this is a far worse option than petrol. Back to our 40-year-old diesel lump. I have 1975 EPA emissions testing results for a 240D equipped W115. Carbon dioxide was about 250 grams per kilometre, carbon monoxide was about 0.75, hydrocarbons about 0.1, and NOx came in at about 0.9. Compare this to the latest equivalent E-Class diesel, an E220D. 55% less CO2, 88% less carbon monoxide, and 93% less hydrocarbons and NOx. So you take the old car route. Will you be giving everyone you pass lung cancer? Yes. Yes, you will. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. Everyone else is giving them cancer too, but that doesn't really make it any better. This aspect is worst in cities and built-up areas, and this is where battery electric vehicles and clean air zones really are genuinely useful. Although I mentioned tyre emissions earlier. Yeah, this is one of those things where it's difficult to draw any sort of line. Society globally now is in a place where almost everything we do consumes a resource and generates toxic waste. Which brings me nicely to the other environmental aspect of an old Mercedes diesel, the greenhouse gases. We can do now, and Mercedes does, what's called a life cycle assessment, where they go through every resource use and emission from construction, use, eventual disposal of the vehicle. For this, we use the term CO2 equivalents, because different greenhouse gases have different global warming potentials. For example, NOx is about 273 times worse than CO2 gram for gram over 100 years, give or take. We can multiply raw NOx emissions figures by 273 to get the CO2 equivalent, and that way we can report one single figure. Different constituent gases have different potentials, and these can all be added together to give one CO2 equivalents in tonnes. Now, it's very easy to say that new cars emit less CO2 while you're driving them, therefore they are more environmentally friendly. But we have to remember that there are CO2 emissions from building a car every time you build a car. Something like 36% of the E220D's total life cycle emissions come from its construction. That 36% assumes a working life of about 250,000 kilometres, but in real terms it is some 8.3 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per car. If somebody is buying a new car every 3 years, that is 8.3 tonnes every 3 years. You, in your 40-year-old 240D, are only responsible for the construction of one car. You also haven't been responsible for the disposal of a car. However, if you drive 20,000 kilometres per year in your 240D, which it's well fit for, allowing for NOx at a global warming potential of 273, your CO2 equivalent will be about 10 tonnes, and 5.5 tonnes of that is NOx. Those same 20,000 kilometres in a brand new E220D cost the planet about 3 tonnes in CO2 equivalents. Now, to give a bit of perspective, emissions per passenger for a return flight from London to New York are about 1.5 tonnes per passenger. Currently, heating a house in the UK is responsible for an average of about 2.7 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year, and average transport emissions per household are 2.3 tonnes per year. I don't want to get into whataboutery, but what about an electric car? Well, let's take the Mercedes equivalent, since they've been good enough to do the life cycle assessment for it. The EQE 350 Plus looks to me like the nearest thing to an E220D if you wanted to go down the full EV route. Total life cycle emissions for the EQE are reported at 30.1 tonnes CO2 equivalents at current electricity mix. And another of the great questions over the effectiveness of EVs is the energy source. If 100% of the energy to operate the car was generated with renewables, the life cycle value would drop to 14 tonnes. But that's not a realistic prospect just now. The life cycle emissions for the 220D stand at 36 tonnes, so only about 6 more tonnes over a life cycle. And that assumes that at least some of the electricity to power the car is coming from zero emission sources. So there is uncertainty there. That also assumes that both vehicles will last 250,000 kilometres. This all sounds very doom and gloom. So can your environmental conscience be clear while daily driving a 240D? Well, like anything, it depends. It gets touted a little bit that the average emissions of a classic car are the same as drinking 3 coffees a day. And that is true if you're only doing average classic car mileages. If your commute is 20,000 kilometres per year, then unfortunately you will be a net polluter. As we've discussed, the average household in the UK is responsible for about 2.3 tonnes per year in transport-based CO2 emissions. So let's see, if in your 240D you did 5,000 kilometres per year, or 3,100 miles, you would come in at about 2.5 tonnes. Now the average UK car mileage is about 7,000 miles annually, or about 11,200 kilometres. So going by the averages, you would have to halve your amount of miles to pollute the equivalent of everybody else on average. It can be done. If you have an environmental conscience and your annual commute is less than 3,000 miles, happy days, you can sleep soundly at night. I know some of you won't care a bit what the emissions are, and I know for some of you it'll be weighing heavily on your decision. It can be done. It'll ultimately be up to you whether an old Mercedes diesel fits the bill. Certainly the car is mechanically up to it with a bit of maintenance. I'm currently driving a 240TD every day for the last 2 months. I'll report back in a year's time and let you know how it goes. Certainly it's an interesting and different option for daily transport. These cars are long past the point where they were common on the road. So if you like attention, you'll certainly get it in either a W115 or a W123. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of 427 Motorsports. If you're considering an old car, an old diesel, hopefully it's given you something to think about. The great irony is that by 2025, if you live in London, all of these cars are going to be ULEZ exempt, despite the fact that you're polluting like hell. If you have enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe. It really does help us. Let us know in the comments whether you agree or disagree. Can the 240D be daily driven? Can it be done environmentally? Does it matter? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Good luck.